Good morning, everybody. Happy Monday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. We got a fantastic panel. Will Jawando, Philip Wegman. We've got Zed Jalani on to talk about how the UK's Labour Party lost the working class. We've got Trita Parsi on to talk about the latest in terms of the Iran nuclear deal. But we wanted to start with what was the biggest miss in decades in terms of Friday's jobs report.
Yeah, that's right. So basically what happened on Friday is that non-farm payrolls, they grew by 266,000. That was forecasters had expected to see 1 million. And immediately an avalanche of takes launched. The right wing says that it's all because of unemployment. Left says you got to pay more in wages. What's the truth? Well, it all lies in the middle. And there's actually an excellent piece by Heather Long. Let's put this up there on the screen from the Washington Post, which says it's not, quote, a labor shortage. It is a great reassessment of work in America. So what exactly does Heather mean by this? Because I actually think it's a very, very important concept. And what it is she is saying there, Krystal, is that when you have a disconnection from the labor force and you have a prolonged 16-month period and all of that, people make different choices. They start to question assumptions. They start to say, hey, is this job really so good? After all, maybe I could do something else. Now you've spent 16 months at home. Maybe you want to stay at home permanently. Maybe some people invested in education. Now they want to go back to school. All of that. The great reassessment, especially you are seeing in lower wage industries in particular. So it's not just, though, a relationship of wage, even with Uber drivers. You can see this. There's a good piece in the Washington Post over the weekend. Uber is investing $250 million, throwing it at work, being like, please come back. And many people are like, man, I don't really want to. Like, actually, it turns out driving for Uber kind of sucks. And like, no matter how much money that you're going to throw, I'm not necessarily going to make that decision. And this is the critical part. It's not because just they are receiving unemployment. That is part of the calculus. You can't deny it. But that they basically are saying, they're saying like, no, I'm going to go and do X, or I'm going to go get certified for this, or I've decided to go work in a different industry. So the great reassessment of work, especially in lower wage industries, service sector jobs, and more, that is actually what I think the biggest part of this entire story is.
There's a couple pieces here. So number one, people are not just the like fungible automatons that economists assume them to be. So yeah, when you've had a year when your entire life has been turned upside down and you've been forced to approach work differently or make different childcare arrangements, and we'll get into that in a minute, then you can't just snap your fingers and people go right back to work at the same wages and in the same industries that they were before. Part of what Heather Long talks about here too is like people who were foisted onto the front lines working low wage jobs in a grocery store, for example, are saying like, to hell with this. Why do I want to do this job? Maybe I should move and work in warehousing. Maybe I should go back to school. Maybe I should reassess. Even people, she tracks how there was a decline in the number of workers at nursing homes. Again, those were some of the hardest hit places in terms of COVID. Obviously, it's not that there's less of a demand or less of a need for workers in those industries, but people are saying, I'm done with this. This put my life at risk. And again, these are oftentimes extraordinarily difficult and extraordinarily low wage jobs, so people are reassessing. On the piece of like, oh, it's unemployment and everyone's just being lazy and staying home. To me, this is pretty simple. Conservatives and sort of Reagan-style trickle-down people who buy into that economic philosophy, they always want to make not working as miserable as possible to force people back into the workforce at the lowest possible wage. And part of what Joe Weisenthal talks about in his letter, and I think he's a really just like straight down the middle, really honest actor on these things, is he's like, employers have been used to basically having an endless supply of cheap labor and not having to do anything to win workers back. That may be changing. So on the left, of course, the argument is, well, rather than making like staying at home, forcing you into starvation or like kicking you out of your home, why don't you make working a little more appealing? You've got a labor force that basically hasn't seen a wage increase in 40 years. So the idea that the market would be a little bit tighter and you'd have to pay people a little bit more, give them a little bit of benefits, or be even things like making sure that they actually have reliable work schedules so that they can figure out their life around that, that may be the way to get people back into the market rather than just, cutting them off in the knees after a year that's been extraordinarily disruptive and difficult all the way around.
Can we throw Joe's tweet back up there on the screen because it's important. That chart that you can see there, which is service sector. So the biggest argument around the unemployment being basically the major cause is people are saying, well, anecdotally, my restaurant can't hire. But actually, leisure hospitality employment accounted for more than all the jobs gained in the last month, and it gained over 330,000 people. Now, that doesn't mean that they've gained back all of their jobs. You can see that plunge in the amount of unemployment claims there. But it would not at least comport with the idea that no restaurant can hire anybody because nobody wants to go back to work, because they actually, 330,000 people across the country just last month actually did go back to work. And I want to make that key point too, which is that conservatives, a lot of Trump people, understood the power of a tight labor market and the depressive effect of mass immigration during the Trump years. And there was all these stories that Republicans were pointing to about Taco Bell has to pay highest wages in decades because of the lowest amount of immigration, etc. And I was like, hey, great, I think that's a good thing. And it's interesting. I think it was Matt Iglesias who pointed out that conservatives who love tight labor markets like to only talk about immigration, and then liberals who like tight labor markets only like to talk about it whenever it comes to unemployment. I would like to just be consistent and say, I think generally tight labor markets are very, very good things in terms of their upward pressure on wages. That being said, and I understand it's not fair necessarily with such a fast transition to some of these businesses, a great idea that I've seen is that the current way that you could split the difference is to be able to let UI, the benefits of the $300 extra, you can actually use that as some sort of a hiring bonus. So this is easily administered through the states, and you could say, hey, you get to keep your money and you can go back to work. That's a perfect way in order to make sure that this transits and actually would take some of the pressure off of the businesses and make it so that we have more of a private-public partnership thing. We can't let people fail, but you can't let small businesses fail, because obviously I think Chipotle is about to announce a wage increase, like they can afford it necessarily. There are some people that can't, but the easiest way to split the difference here, and this is why, it's not like I expect any Republicans to come out and say this, where if you really did want some of these businesses to succeed, then you're like, okay, we'll use this money and bolster their wage. One of my favorite ideas during the pandemic was actually Romney, who's teaming up with some of the Democrats about talking about Patriot Pay, paying essential workers like grocery workers and more, an extra $12 on top of what they were getting, with 3/4 paid by the government, 1/4 paid by the private employer. That type of system, if that truly is where we're at right now, go ahead. You could solve this quite easily with money, but that's not forthcoming, which is what pisses me off.
Not to mention, small businesses, you're absolutely right. It's not so easy to just be like, well, just pay people more when you're operating tight margins. I mean, part of the story of that is the way that just our entire economic system has completely screwed over small businesses and made it almost impossible to survive. And of course, the big guys just got bigger during the pandemic, and monopoly power, all of those things.
They got tons of money.
Play into this situation. It's not just workers needing more money in order to go back to work. And then the other piece of this on the people aren't just the fungible automatons that economists assume them to be, is women in particular, they bore the brunt of the complete collapse in the child care, what passes for a child care system in this country. And you can see this. This has been an ongoing trend where you see women losing jobs even as men are gaining them. You can see that here. And you can also see People's Policy Project dug into the numbers of what's going on in terms of the shifting labor force. Let's throw A1D up on the screen now as well. And you can see that women actually, what this chart shows, the number of women moving into employment, moving from employment into unemployment, or moving out of the labor force entirely. So that those two bars on the right, those are women who are moving out of the labor force entirely. And you can see from March to April, huge jump in the number of women who are just saying, I'm not looking for a job, I'm not trying to get a job, I'm out entirely. And I think part of that, look, this is all educated guessing and speculation, but I think it's fairly reasonable speculation on that front. Part of that is the fact you had a lot of child care providers closed during the year.
Yes.
You had schools closed. So, and look, I wish it was otherwise. Wish that the share of parenting was a little more equitably shared in this country, but it's just not the case. Women were the ones who bore the brunt of, okay, I'm going to be the homeschooler while my kids are doing Zoom school. I'm going to rearrange my life. I'm going to either cut back on hours. I'm going to drop out of the labor force entirely. And you can't just snap your fingers and expect everybody to go back and be able to completely reform their lives again, especially when a lot of schools are still closed. So you still have that childcare burden on them. And if you're getting a little bit of money on unemployment, that helps soften the blow. So that your calculus of like, geez, I'm going to pay for a childcare provider. How am I even going to find a childcare provider that I trust? Or am I just going to continue to suck it up and stay home? Or, some people may also have decided, like, I actually enjoyed being home with my kids this year.
Yeah, and this is, again, goes to where all the policy on this just disconnects. I think the number one thing, and I saw this, a decent piece in Breitbart, of all places, which was talking about how school closure is actually having a very downward pressure effect on female labor participation rate, which is that you've only got around 60-something% of kindergartners who are full-time back in school. And of course, that is the exact age where if you don't have the school system, in addition to mass closure of childcare, daycare centers all across the country, these businesses run on very tight margins. And so they are all largely failed during the pandemic and even with PPP and all of that. So there's a huge mess whenever it comes to that. I do think that school reopening is one of the chief things which could not solve this, but I would say maybe 60% of the problem. What's the issue? It's May. It's May 10th.
Right,
So school's going to be out in like 10 days. And so then what? Now what do we do? Well, this is where having like robust summer school and some sort of summer program, exactly, that we have got to make sure that happens, or you're actually going to have more of a depressed opening. But like you said, if you like staying home, that's fine. And this is where I would call upon my Republican brethren, if you're actually serious in your critiques of universal childcare and more, let's propose a multi-$1,000 payment to anybody who wants to stay home or use it as a daycare credit. You can do whatever the hell you want. We'll pay you. You want to raise your kid? You want to go back to work? Or you want to go back to work, but you don't need money in order to put daycare? Fine. All good. If you want to stay home, good. That's all good for society. These are things where, again, if people on the right were really serious, they would be putting these proposals. You have maybe one senator who's doing it.
That is one of the areas where there's like just a glaring hypocrisy in the Republican stance of like every person must re-enter the labor force at whatever price we're willing to pay. And on the other hand, a celebration, I think rightly so, of like family and choice for women. If they want to work, great. If they don't want to work and they want to be home with their kids, that's fantastic as well. So those two things are kind of at odds with one another, and they don't seem to ever resolve that conflict. The last thing I'll say on this is some economists were saying, like, look, take this with a big grain of salt, because part of why we ended up with this gigantic miss was the seasonal adjusting that goes on. Look, these numbers, just remember, like, these are all based on calculations and estimations. So it's not just like we know what numbers are created. They take the number, then they adjust it down to seasonally reflect normal flows in labor. And because things have been so incredibly weird, it's entirely possible that the adjustments they made there don't really reflect reality. So that's the other piece that we should take into consideration here. But the fact that you had such a huge miss, as I said, the largest in decades between what they thought was going to happen and what actually happened. And it wasn't only that. They also went back and adjusted down some of the jobs numbers from the past so that they weren't as good as we thought they were at the time. It's a big warning sign, and I think something that we're going to be taking a lot of looks at over the coming weeks.
Yeah, that's right.
We're going to tell you what's on our radars. That's next.